Hi, this is Guy Burgess. I wanted to spend a little bit of time exploring the paradigm shifts that we think are absolutely essential to this larger project or this larger task of trying to figure out how to move beyond intractability and deal with large-scale complex conflicts. And this is a sort of personal story here. It's a chronicle of the paradigm shifts that Heidi and I have gone through as part of our working lifetimes. Obviously, there are lots of paradigm shifts that happened before that, and different people have different experiences. But for folks based in the United States of the baby boomer generation that came of age in the Vietnam era, I expect the story is relatively similar. The first thing to understand about paradigms is that they're cumulative. As you shift from one paradigm to another, you don't throw away what you've learned in the past. You build on top of it. I've always been a fan of Sir Isaac Newton's line when he was asked how he was able to accomplish so much. He said, "I've been standing on the shoulders of giants." And the truth is that if we're going to get any further in the conflict problem, we too are going to stand on the shoulders of giants, much like this kid is sitting on the shoulders of Albert Einstein in Washington. So again, for us baby boomers, the sort of first introduction to the whole peace and conflict field was as part of the anti-war movement in the Vietnam era. And at the time, the paradigm was pretty simple. We didn't like war. We especially didn't like getting drafted to fight in the war. And, well, we were opposed to that. And this led to a whole range of protests, and it was a lot of the sort of social upheaval of the 60s. And the same sort of thing unfolded into the 80s with the nuclear freeze movement and really efforts to challenge the great nuclear rearmament of the Reagan era, which fortunately for us all led to the end of the Cold War, but it certainly could have gone a different way. It was also a time when there were great marches against U.S. imperialism, especially the School of the Americas, and there were lots of things that the United States did in the name of fighting communism that were pretty reprehensible and we've been struggling with ever since. But it was just a movement of we're against all these things. And ultimately it ran into the limit that it was pretty naive. I mean, maybe the song, "All We're Saying Is Give Peace a Chance," really says it all. We needed, and this is where it wasn't enough to be motivated to end war. You had to understand what it takes to do that. And it's more than just giving peace a chance. So there was another paradigm, and this actually comes way before our era and the Vietnam era, but it's still critically important and worth mentioning. In fact, the truth is these guys actually accomplished vastly more than the anti-war movement was ever able to accomplish. And this is the tradition of nonviolence as exemplified by Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and more recently people like Lama Bowie, who were able to challenge injustice in a way that was really quite remarkable. But that paradigm too runs into trouble. It works in cases where you can mobilize the inherent guilt and contradictions of a society. When you have a society that's willing to ruthlessly put down nonviolent protest, as we saw maybe most spectacularly in Tiananmen Square, things aren't going to go very well at all. So we need to do more than that. Another paradigm arose really sort of in the early 80s with the publication of the only book, at least that I know of, that ever made it onto the New York Times bestseller list for a long, long time to come out of this field. And this was Getting to Yes. And the whole notion of principled negotiation. And, you can actually, by understanding interests and brainstorming options, come up with true win-win solutions to an awful lot of problems. And this was a time where this is a way to actually bring about peace. And this led to a flurry of really optimistic and exciting efforts. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation underwrote not only a whole series of conflict resolution projects, they also underwrote conflict resolution theory centers at major universities, programs like the Program on Negotiation at Harvard, the what now is the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, and we were fortunate to have one of those programs here at the University of Colorado. It was also a time that saw ultimately the development of fields that were brought together under the rubric of the Association for Conflict Resolution that had alternative dispute resolution practices deeply embedded in a wide range of social institutions, as this list of the sections of the ACR really sort of exemplifies. It was also a time when we were thinking, hey, you know, we can apply these concepts to some of the most difficult and intractable conflicts on the planet. The Oslo Accords, the whole Oslo process really came up with something that by all rights looks like a set of win-win solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But it too ran into limits. And the limits probably are sort of most succinctly explained by referring back to Machiavelli and the presence of actors who are willing to exploit the language of conciliation and conflict resolution while pursuing a clearly selfish power over agenda designed to dominate others. And the truth is, interest-based bargaining, for all of its efforts, really hasn't quite come to grips with that. So the next big paradigm that sort of marked our careers has been what you might call the peacebuilding paradigm. That came out of Boutros Ghali's agenda for peace, and the notion that you had to go beyond peacemaking and peacekeeping, but actually peace building, which involves reconciliation and the transformation of whole societies. There are all sorts of exciting initiatives to come out of that.
A lot of these have coalesced under the rubric of the Alliance for Peacebuilding.
Perhaps more remarkably was the U.S. military realizing after the fiasco, or at least what Tom Ricks described as the fiasco of the early days of the war in Iraq, that success there depended on not winning the war, but winning the peace. And the truth is that General Petraeus's counterinsurgency strategy really is the conversion of an awful lot of peace-building ideas into military speak. And here you have Defense Directive 3000.05 that actually directs the Pentagon to understand how to, they call it SSTR for security, stabilization, security, transition, and reconstruction, the process of what used to be called nation building. And then you have such things as USAID has started to understand that all of their aid programs have to be embedded in a conflict framework, and if you don't understand about that, you're not going to be very successful. You have major donors conferences convened in various crisis points and bring people together and try to understand how you can put together a large package of relief efforts that also address conflict resolution issues. You have the emergence of institutions like the United States Institute of Peace, which for the first several decades of its existence lived in the middle floors of this building, literally down the hall from the McDonald's lobbyists, and has now built the kind of reputation that it's enabled it to have this brand new building on the Mall in Washington and the prestige that goes with that. They've written books like Herding Cats that are, how do you get whole societies to start moving in the right direction towards reconciliation? And you have images of folks actually herding cats, and maybe the best strategy for herding cats is moving food bowls. But it too runs into limits. And perhaps most tragically, at least for folks from the United States, the sad story of Iraq and Afghanistan and the sort of deterioration of the Middle East is as a spectacular example as anything of what we still have to learn. We certainly got into these wars in a lot of very, very bad ways, but I was still always moved by the commitment of so many people to try to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan in the right way and ultimately end up doing good by the Iraqi and Afghan people. And the fact that we failed so miserably tells us that we've still got a lot to learn. So all of this has led a lot of folks to start asking some really hard questions about what it's really going to take to move beyond intractability. And here I think the most promising focus really is on trying to come to grips with the scale and complexity of these conflicts. And here I think we need to make a shift from a peace-building paradigm in which somebody's got plans, somebody's organizing it, getting everybody to work on the same sort of thing, to something that might be a little closer to peace cultivating, where you have natural processes that are actually doing the creation, and it's just a process of trying to create more fertile conditions for those processes to go forward. And this suggests that we need something that you might call massively parallel peace building. Instead of having sort of one unity of effort based approach, which is implicit in the donors' conferences and certainly implicit in what folks tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, actually imagine an alternative model in which you have a multitude of independent actors, each trying to contribute to the peace-building process in their own way. This is very much a decentralized model. And going back to the herding cats model, instead of trying to actually have a cat herder, what you really want to do is to cultivate smarter cats, people who understand destructive conflict dynamics, how from their perspective they threaten their future, how they can pursue their self-interest in more enlightened ways, and in the immortal words of President Obama, don't do so much stupid stuff. And so in a sense what we're trying to do is to put together a process. It's not talking so much about massive transformations, which are probably hard to engineer and at least over the near term pretty unrealistic, but instead trying to increase the proportion of constructive to destructive interactions. And in this figure, you've got a lot of sort of underlying constructive interaction having to do with the integrative and exchange system. But what we're most worried about are force-based interactions that tend to be very destructive, and try to shift that to more constructive interactions that tend to rely much more on exchange and persuasion and that sort of thing. So for years we've been trying to think about how one could take advantage of the capabilities of the web and build what amounts to a learning accelerator to help folks from lots of different perspectives in lots of different circles of trust increase the rate at which they learn about more constructive ways of dealing with conflict. And the latest iteration of Beyond Intractability and this whole notion of a massive open online seminar is really an attempt to sort of beta test what we see as the best option out there for trying to do this. And if we can really integrate this into the social networks that are so widely used around the planet and really such a key part of the place where people get information, we will have accomplished a lot. We're still obviously at the very primitive beginning stages of this, and this is going to take lots of people's ideas and efforts. But I think it's a promising place to start. So we want to sort of start here by posing some questions. What ideas do you think need to be part of the new paradigm? What especially do we need to remember and include from older paradigms, and where are areas where we really got to get smarter? And then, of course, how can we use the platform of massive open online social network-based learning systems to promote all of this?